The RuneScape mid-game. The point where a lot of boss fights become viable, but are still pretty difficult to beat. And yet still, it's one of the most fun time because you start learning the game in terms of a PvMer on a whole different level. So I thought for everyone who is at this point, I want to make this video with my 3 best bosses to do when you are a RuneScape 3 mid-level player that is actually looking for a challenge or just some really good money while PvMing. So let's head right into it. Obviously, I am not a mid-level player anymore, and therefore I could just take out my high-level gear, rush these encounters, and then tell you how easy they are. But I decided that I want to check before I make this video on how they actually work and if they are actually possible to do. Therefore, I took out some pretty scuffed gear. Obviously, in my opinion, when you want to start early bossing, Necromancy is still the best choice, just with all the fucking support abilities and stuff you have in the kit, so it's still the best thing you can take, in my opinion. So therefore, I took some pretty scuffed Necromancy gear. I had some tier 80 power armor with the Death Dealer 4-set bonus. I took out some Cinderbanes, which were by far the most expensive thing in this gear setup right here. Then I had the tier 90 weapons because I think they are pretty easy to unlock. You can just unlock the tier 90 tank armor and then also get the tier 90 weapons. That's why I didn't take them as tier 80. Then I had the Nexus, just the normal Death Warden Nexus. I had a Occultist ring, which is a easy buy for about 70 million and is one of the better rings. You can also go for the Sorgov's Soul Ring if you have the quest and have it unlocked. In my case, I did not do that yet on my main, so I still have the Occultist ring. Then I had a Conscious Raising necklace, which is just a phenomenal mid-game necklace, costs less than 300k and is just insane in the stat bonus it gives to you. And for the cape, I just took one of my skill capes out, in this case the Constitution Master Cape. Obviously, if you have, take the Suck Cape, but I decided that a lot of mid-game players will not be able to have a Suck Cape, which is not that big of a deal anymore, to be fair. Since they changed that Death Skulls only need 60 Adren, even if you don't have a Suck Cape, it's still possible to get some nice Living Death rotations and stuff, but yet still, I decided to leave the Suck Cape in my bank for this video. So therefore, pretty scuffed gear, and this was the setup that I went with, and I was able to kill all these bosses pretty easy with a okay pace, I guess, and therefore I can definitely assure you that these are bosses you can do in the mid-level. But you know what isn't a really scuffed move? Is to like and subscribe on this video. Nah, I'm just kidding, but like and subscribe. Okay, the first boss that we want to take a look at is basically the best boss that you can start out, even as a low-level player, because we are looking at our favorite icicle, the Arch-Glacor. This guy is basically a boss that starts out in normal mode with 0 mechanics, where he is basically just a damage dummy, can then be done with up to 5 mechanics in normal mode, and if you mastered him with 5 mechanics, you can then even start going into hard mode, and therefore also streaking him up to 4000 enrage. And obviously a 4000 enrage Arch-Glacor is a really high level boss and is definitely nothing for the mid level. It's a matter of fact that when you do him at like 0 enrage, 50 enrage, 100 enrage, he is pretty simple and also easily done with a mid level gear setup. The boss is poisonable, so Cinderbanes, weapon poison, indication sticks, all that stuff works pretty good and does some extra damage. And in my case, because I was still at a streak, I think I did him around 600 enrage with my scuffed gear, where I definitely had some problems because he was just incredible tanky and did a lot of damage. But what I recommend to all of you is just start out at 0 enrage and then just try to up the enrage always a little bit, because according to the wiki, he is about 18 mil per hour if you do him at 0 enrage and then always claim the loot. So therefore you can get some good money while also trying to find out how far you can go with the enrage. And when you then start feeling comfortable at something like 200, 250 enrage, you can even start streaking him and, for example, get to a 20 kill streak with 250 enrage at the end or something and get some pretty good good chances on a drop. I mean, then you look at a 1 in 170 for one of the rares, which is pretty decent. And since melee prices are pretty high at the moment, so even the Dark Ice Shard, for example, that you get from these Dark Nylas drop or can create after that are traded for about 30 mil. All of the rares that you can get at Arch-Glacor are pretty valuable. I mean, you look at the Length artifact that is about 20 mil when you create the gloves. You look at the Scripture of Wen that is over 20 mil, the Dark Nylas that comes to about 4 mil per shard, and when you streak him to 20 you can get 6 shards with 1 drop, so can also be easily over 20 mil this drop. And then obviously the Frozen Core of Length, that is by far the best drop but also the rarest, but this one would be worth about 630 mil when you create the weapon. So Arch-Glacor is a phenomenal boss, especially for learning some mechanics and stuff, but also makes you decent money. And as you can see in the video in the background, you are able to kill him with mid-level gear in a lower end rage pretty easy. Next up on the list is one of my favorite bosses. We are talking about Araxxor. I recently finished the log, and I can definitely say Araxxor was one of the bosses where I started out with some PVMing. Back then, not even with necromancy gear, and rather just with insanely scuffed range gear sometimes. I remember going there with a royal crossbow and stuff. And this boss is pretty interesting, because at 0 enrage, he is really easy. But with every kill, the enrage goes up by 20%, and this resets on a daily basis, or when you use a Araxxor pheromone, which is an item that you can get from the spider or buy for about 1 mil GP in the Grand Exchange. So therefore, you are a little bit limited on how many kills you can do a day with a mid-level or scuffed gear setup, because I think after about 150 or 200 enrage, the boss becomes kinda challenging because he just deals a lot of damage, and you are a little bit time gated because you have to wait until the web burns down and all that stuff. So therefore, I think as a mid-level player that has no experience or almost no experience with bossing, you have a few options when it comes to Araxxor. You either just treat him as a daily challenge and, for example, do 1 hour of Araxxor every day, which is definitely something that, yeah, will be a valuable option and is basically what I did back in the days. Or you can also farm him and then just every once in a while maybe use a pheromone, or just prove me wrong and do her at fucking 300 enrage, which should also be possible, to be honest. The mechanics are not that hard to learn, but can be pretty punishing if you do them wrong. Also, a matter of fact for Araxxor is that you have 3 paths that you can choose from, and 2 of them are open, and this changes, I think, weekly. And depending on the path you take, he has a different difficulty level. For example, as a mid-level player, I think that the mid and the top path are definitely harder than the bottom path. And as a mid-level player, I even think that the top path is the hardest because of all the spider minions that you have to deal with. But I, recommend to you that you go into the lower path. And when you have unlocked the combat achievements and can even choose which paths are open, I always open middle and bottom and then go through the bottom. If you look at the drops, we can also see that you have to go through every path at one point, because the comments are pretty good, but what you obviously want is to create that spider leg, because this is really valuable. And you can get a leg piece for every path that you went through. So when you go through the bottom path, you can only get the bottom leg piece. So therefore, if you want to create the leg, you have to do all the paths eventually. But depending on which one you are actually on, I think you can go up to a little bit higher enrages than with other ones. For example, up to 100, 150 enrage, every path is definitely viable with some scuffed mid-level gear. Should be no problem, especially with necromancy, where you have so much heal in the kit thanks to the ghost. So therefore, Araxxor is a phenomenal moneymaker. And just one last tip at the end for the boss fight, because you can actually choose in which form Araxxor spawns. Because Araxxor spawns as a melee, major, or ranger, depending on what gear you basically wear. Because when you are in a private instance, you just have to equip the right weapon to get the opposite spider spawn. So in a private instance, you, for example, can load into the instance, equip Equip a bow until the spider is spawned and she will always be in mage form. When you equip a staff, it is always the melee form, and when you equip a melee weapon, it is always the ranged form. This can also be done in the public instance, but then you just need a Araxxor pheromone in your inventory. You don't need to use them, you just need to have it in the inventory. And it can be pretty interesting to choose what form she will spawn in, because I, for example, think that she is way easier in mage than in ranged or melee, and the melee version of her is by far the hardest. But with the form that you spawn her in, you can also choose the probabilities of the drops, because I already told you about the spider leg that is pretty valuable. You also can drop a hilt that you combine with the spider leg to make even more money with the boss. And depending on what form she is on, the probability for a hilt gets higher or lower. So when you kill her as a melee spider, you have a higher chance to get a Araxxor Fang than the Araxxor's Web or Araxxor's Eye. And if you spawn her as a ranged, the probability for the web is higher, etc, etc. So if you want to go for the maximum chance with making money, you should always kill her as a melee spider. But if you want the most comfortable fight, I think you should spawn her as a major. According to the wiki, Araxxor is about 40 mil per hour, so therefore pretty good money, and I think it's a pretty entertaining fight, so definitely worth doing. At spot number 3, I have something that I always love to do. It's the Elite Dungeons, or more specifically, the Elite Dungeon 2, because this encounter is definitely the easiest out of the 3 original Elite Dungeons, but has some incredible valuable drops. Because since the combat changes, the prices of the rares in the Elite Dungeon 2 have risen like crazy. I mean, the Greater Fury ability codex sells for about 450 mil, and the other ones also both for over 100 mil. And even the Draconic Energy is back at 180,000 coins, which is the backbone of this dungeon in terms of making money. And I just think that the dungeon in a whole is a pretty entertaining thing to do. The bosses in the dungeons are all poisonable, as are the minions that you kill along the way, and therefore Cinderbanes or also weapon poison and all that stuff have a incredible value. And let's be honest, if you run the Elite Dungeon and you are lucky and get one of those codexy, you will look at some insane money rain, and this will definitely fund a lot on your journey to the high level gear. So therefore, Elite Dungeon 2 definitely worth camping in terms of the money. And what I think is really cool, that when you want to farm this one, a Dragon Slayer perk on one of your weapons is just insane valuable there. Just simply because it's all dragons, and then you can basically just get some extra damage, and this is something that you can get pretty easy as a pretty budget perk. And if you remember my Bronzeman series, you know exactly that this was something I did in the mid game a lot, where I just run the Elite Dungeon 2 over and over again. And I was super lucky, got 2 of the Greater Fury codexy, which were worth about 200 mil back then, and now they are even more worth with 450 mil. So therefore, Elite Dungeon 2 is something you can run, is pretty viable. Also with the scuffed gear, I did not have insane high kill times and stuff, and as soon as you get 1 or 2 drops, you can easily fund some better gear and then be even faster at this encounter. And I gotta say, Elite Dungeons are always really fun to do. So yeah, there you have it. These were my best 3 bosses that you can farm in the mid game to make some incredible money, but also learn about the mechanics of the game. And if you are lucky, you get some rare drops, you can then fund even better gear, and then maybe even start higher level bosses and stuff. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video as always. If so, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, leave a comment with your best bosses to kill, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!